So I'll say the Lord be with you, and you'll say,
and also
And
with
also
you.
with you.
lift up your hearts.
We
We
lift them to the Lord.
Let us give thanks to the Lord our God.
It is right to give God
God
thanks.
thanks and praise.
Praise.
It is right, rejoicing always, to thank the Lord for each new day. Any prayer requests? Anyone have anything to share? And then there's no devotion tonight. We'll leave Augustine on the shelf, so to speak. But any particular prayer requests as we get started?
My father-in-law is still recovering from what appeared to be a stroke last week. It wasn't a stroke, which is good. It's a hematoma of sorts. He goes for another set of CAT scans in a couple days, and they'll decide that day if there's surgery required or not.
Okay. Well, we'll keep your father-in-law in our prayers and the family. Particularly for your wife, I'm sure that is really nerve-wracking from that standpoint. Any other requests or needs? No? Okay. Adam, your father-in-law's first name again?
Derek.
Derek. Okay. All right. Well, let's pray. Okay. Gracious God, I thank you. I thank you for my friends. Thank you for the opportunity to gather, albeit through technology. But always trust that your spirit is truly the one that binds us this evening together. And even as we offer prayer requests, well, your spirit is already at work. And so we just continue to pray now for Derek, for his health and wholeness. We pray for Adam's wife and for the rest of the family. In the uncertainty of this moment, just pray your peace to rest upon the family. Pray wisdom over the doctors and the decisions that they'll make, but ultimately trust it's your spirit that brings the healing. So ask, Lord, that please would your spirit indeed intervene in Derek's life and for the sake of the family. I really do think there's probably other requests or needs tonight, Lord. It's that time of the semester. There are probably myriad of responsibilities and challenges that are a part of the lives of each and every one of us. Again, some that we may just feel is too mundane to mention, others may be too profound. But I do trust your spirit to be at work in all things, ultimately for the sake of, well, not just your glory, but for the sake of the reconciliation of all things as well. Pray your guidance this evening by the power of the Spirit. Help us to listen carefully to each other and learn from each other as we go forward. In Christ's name. Amen. Now, we can do it a couple things, just road rules for the sake of time. I've given each of you the capacity to share screen if you wanted to put your outline up visually. All of them are on Moodle. Did everybody get a chance? You could just open up your computer and access those Word docs. Okay, so everybody's either gotten them, downloaded them, or at least you can get to them, right? Or he goes, I got to pick up my laptop. So, okay. Well, if we have them, and I actually, for the first time in a while, printed something out, then we can just have these in front of us and just have people kind of walk us through. I'm going to do something. I know Delmy has another conflict later, so I'm going to let her lead off for the discussion. And Delmy, I still have the first version that you had. I didn't get a chance to get that to the download of the second one, so you'll have to add that in. Let me stop share real quick. Okay. But after Delmy, we're actually going to do in reverse order. So Kendra, you'll be next, and then we'll work our way backwards. That means bad news is that Becky, you'll be the last presentation tonight, and we'll just kind of walk our way in reverse alphabetical after Delmy does her presentation. Okay. All right. So Delmy, if you will take us through, and I'll kind of keep an eye on the clock. I'll give you, if you're, you may be looking down, but I'll give like a 2-minute warning and then a 1 minute, just so that you stay within the 10-minute frame. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Mic check? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. And as Dr. Blevins mentioned, I have a double header tonight, so I have to step away at 8 o'clock. It's 7:10 our time. Apologies for that. So the project that I'll be working on, and if you see here the thesis, there's always a lot of notion, especially here in the Northeast. The word on the street is that church-led spiritual retreats are a thing of the past. And the purpose of this actual project is to study the impact of women's spiritual church retreats through the analysis of 5 years of data of a local church, and also interviewing 4 women who attended their retreats for 5 consecutive years. So 4 women attended these retreats for 5 years consecutively, and I'm gonna interview them. I already interviewed 2 of them, and looking at their experience and what was the outcome and the impact, not only locally, but actually even in the district level. So the project outline, and please, if you have any questions anytime, just feel free to chime in. So this is more of a task. It's an analysis type of data leading to the assessment of women's spiritual retreats. I'll be analyzing the practical theological concepts that will break down and differentiate spiritual sound women's retreats. So it'll be a breakdown. So I'm gathering information for 5 years worth of spiritual retreats, 2 retreats per year. That's a total of 10 retreats. Just to sort of some background, the average attendees were about 200 to 250 women. That's a lot of women from Friday to Sunday. I'll be analyzing the impact of these retreats and what kind of impact it has on the participants and these women, including spiritual growth, interpersonal relationships from where they were to where they ended up after the 5 years. If they ended up serving in the local congregation, and also if there was any type of call to ministry after going to this impactful retreats. Also, the point is to assess the impact on the local congregation. Was there unity and fellowship, teamwork, church growth? Within that, of course, spiritually, numerically, financially, and also the vision. Did the vision change? Did the vision grow? What could have been done different? Or how did it go from the first year, and what was enhanced or changed during those retreats throughout that 5-year time frame? And of course, the theology shaping this project, it's the reflection around gathering. Again, here in the Northeast, it's like, we have a lot of beautiful camps, but we don't really use them as much. And this particular church uses this retreat, the Church of the Nazarene retreat, where there's 250 acres worth of beautiful landscape and lakes. So they really took advantage of that. And to the point, and the reason this caught my attention, folks, is because there's a lot of actually churches that have modeled this type of retreat within our district. And they've tapped into this church and said, what is it that you're doing? You're doing things different. And also they mentored other churches to do the same. And as a consequence, these churches are now doing a lot of retreats. So there's a revival going on around church-led spiritual retreats. So that's the gist of my project, very high level. But again, it's something that I grew up in camps, being in church for quite some time. So that's kind of where I'm heading with this. Any questions, folks?
I'll turn it over to class first. Any questions you would have?
What's the size or demographic of this church?
The church is about 500 people in the church. So about 200 to 250 women attend these retreats. I have a question for you all. Are you surprised, curious to hear around the country is our church retreat something that it's still done, being conducted in your areas or not?
Delmy, one of the so our church kind of wrestles with this. One of the things that the reasons that we've wrestled with it, we've gone kind of more to like a Friday afternoon, Saturday morning kind of concept. And then COVID, obviously things haven't happened. But one of the things that we wrestled with a lot is the role of motherhood and the expectations there. We didn't find that a lot of fathers, for whatever reason, were able to care for the children, and that took a lot of mothers out of it. So I'm just curious if, obviously we probably don't have enough time to get into it. Maybe you haven't come across this, but I was just curious if you were going to mention that in your project or look at that.
Great question. And that's one of the biggest hurdles, has been when the first year in, it was 38 women, 38 to 40 women. So it grew every year. Now to the point that the entire camp is filled with these lovely women who come in on a Friday night. A lot of work. It's like coordinating a wedding. And we worked a lot with the men to get them situated and going. And I say we because it's actually, this is our church. I'll say it. I think that's safe to say. So it was a lot of work, Deanna. I mean, a lot of negotiating, a lot of hand holding with the men, and a lot of those men are not Christian. But when you saw from year to year, these women who experienced I can't go this year, I'll pray. We had prayer teams getting up at 5 a.m. for the next go round saying, we're going to pray for Deanna and Raquel to come and Kendra to come. Raquel, I called you Raquel, you're Rachel, but you're my Raquel. So it was an amazing thing to see. And we started to mentor. So the word got out. And we were mentoring other pastors, other women, female leaders within their church, ordained ministers who were like, what are we doing? Or even the ones who were in track, even made it a project to come on board, and we helped them in the process. That was the biggest hurdle.
Okay, anyone else? Other questions? Well, I'll offer a couple. I have a couple questions, and then for clarification. So basically, you're trying to analyze 5 years of qualitative data, but you're only interviewing 4 women to do that, or I'm looking at the top of your paper.
Mm-hmm.
So there's only out of those, say, 5 years, starting at 38, but by the end, over 250 women attending, but you're only going to do 4 women. Is that because there's just a very limited number who actually showed for all 5 years, or is that just a representative sample?
It's a representative sample.
Okay.
And the representative sample is based on a cascade of what each one represents, which is within its own realm, because there were subgroups within these groups that flourished, different ministries, really impactful ministries in the community. Our church is near the Lincoln Tunnel. So I can take, and we can talk this offline, Dr. Blevins, I can definitely take more women, but these were the 4 subgroups that I thought were more impactful. And within that, there'll be sub pockets of women that will be represented. So they'll actually going to be surveyed too.
Yeah, I would say, just from my perspective, one of the things I would be cautious about, I mean, we'll go back to Deanna's comment, and how you would deal not only with positives, but also with the challenges. Yep. And so this doesn't come off like a promotional piece that merely is a justification of what you've done, as opposed to a true exploration of what's provided. And so I would normally, and I'm not really, for this class, Dr. Wesley would probably be more on the ethnographic side of this and the courses he does. But I'd say even for this, Pete Ward has some guidelines for the beginning of ethnographic work. Make sure your methodology is clear, and really make the case for why 4 women would truly be representative of something that at another level, you're arguing scale, so that it, for an outside reader, it becomes, if this thing has had such a broad reach, why would just these 4 women be truly representative of the diverse population? So this is more in that empirical piece and making sure that people understand your methodology well and why these would be truly representative, even before you get to the underlying piece. And it doesn't, and I'm not saying you did this, so hear me, but it doesn't come off in the writing as if they were cherry picked, because they do represent things you want to go ahead and argue for. But that in some ways, those categories are for exploration as well as for advocacy. Really becomes, I think, important in how you write this. This is always the challenge of ethnographic work, is when are you really, really demonstrating the efficacy of what's going on, particularly when you're that close to something, as opposed to something that you don't have an investment in. And so you have a kind of what Don Browning once called a gracious nonchalance. You're not, you don't care whether you find good or bad. You're just curious to find out what's there. So your passion for this, make sure you mute that with some pretty strong methodology around it, so that people don't misread that focus. I hope that makes sense.
It does, and thank you. And for clarification, one of the subgroups is actually, they're my negative Nancy's. They actually fell off the trail, to the point where even in a leadership meeting, they were like, we don't want this. We don't want to do this. It's too much work. I mean, and that's one of the subgroups that's being represented for Fair Balance. So we're going to have kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. All 3 outcomes will be presented. I share this with my husband, kind of just says, should I do this one? Because we have invested so much into this. And he's like, well, just be careful. And he brought that up as well. So I was and that was kind of the notion, the negative Nancy group, I call them. They're still in church, but they're like, and they actually have a compassionate ministry. So we kind of turned it around and said, what are we out to do? They don't want to be part of it. And they were crucial and instrumental in the growth. But then they said, no, we don't want to fight this battle and you'll see the reasons why.
Okay. It might help, and I'm mindful of the time. I don't want to, so I'm bracketing everybody to 15 minutes. I'm going to say this to several people, but for you, it might be helpful to see if you can triangulate some of the information you're getting with maybe other studies in women's spirituality, so that as you're pulling information out, you can cross-reference it to either, and I'm just thinking about articles, I'm not talking about books, so trust me on that, but just to see through EBSCO or through an online search, have there ever been other research around women in gathering, and for the sake of spiritual nurture and growth, and are what you're hearing either similar or different from that? It's always good to check your perceptions against a broader research base. And for many of the other students, it won't be as big a deal, but definitely, since you're leaning on ethnographic research, it really helps to do that. Then you could use some of that information to go, okay, so how does this help me theologically understand the spirituality of gathering, so that becomes a part. And I always do this. There's many different places at the bottom of the wheel where you can have a theological conversation. It could come out of the history of women and their spirituality and other forms of gatherings, including not just nuns, but particularly lay women gatherings like the Beguines come to mind as a group out of the history of the church. Or it can be more on sort of a spiritual women in spirituality or women in theology. I mean, there are different ways, and it's almost, you can't really know which of those are the best conversations until you've got those 4 interviews done and you know what the themes are to bring into that conversation. So this is definitely a cart and horse kind of conversation from that standpoint. But if you at least explore women's spirituality in gatherings, I mean, for lack of a better way of saying it, and at least as you're building the crosstab at the top of the exploration of practical theology, you're starting to find out where the research is that could be available at the bottom of the wheel as well.
Mhm.
So just something to kind of consider from that standpoint. Okay.
Okay, perfect.
All right.
Noted.
All right. Anybody else? One last comment? Anybody? Okay. The only one thing, it's tough to be the guinea pig and be the first person out from that standpoint. Everybody's kind of probably looking at each other going, wow, what else do I need to say? But thank you for starting there. And then we're just going to keep moving along. Kendra, you're next. So whether you want to share or just have us take a look at it. Does everybody have Kendra's document or have it where you can see it? Okay, let me just make sure. All right.
Can you guys see my desktop?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I can start?
Yeah, go right ahead.
So one of the things that kind of struck me during this course was on the cycle was priestly listening and really assessing why, the why behind certain things. And it really has caused me to think a lot in terms of the why, even in, as it relates to the ministry that I'm part of. So that's kind of what I want to look at, specifically how priestly listening is foundational in developing actual ministries, specifically urban ministry. And the thing that kind of, as I've been going through this class, I've been thinking a lot about, it almost kind of makes you think about where you go wrong, or just seeing different things and how things play out in real life. And so for me, I'm not a pastor, but I work closely with my pastor. My dad is the pastor. And so I've had a lot of opportunities to kind of see behind the scenes in terms of what's effective, especially in terms of like on the ground work. So we've done a lot of outreach, but we've kind of done it a little bit differently from our standpoint, because we partner a lot with not mega churches, but very affluent churches in the Orlando area. And so we've worked with a lot of affluent Caucasian churches. And so one of the things that we've discovered is basically a lot of times most of the members have money and they're looking to serve somewhere through their giving, through their financial support, through their resources. One particular church we worked with not only had a lot of members that were wealthy, but a lot of them had influence within the city government in different places. So long story short, we've ended up partnering with them, and they kind of, we had some issues because we knew the community, right? Because our church is in the community. And so we've got members from the community that are part of the church, and we also was already doing outreach there. So when we partnered with this outside ministry, there was some clashing because they really didn't have the understanding of what the community entailed, and there was some lacking of priestly listening on that end to really understand why things were the way they were. And so long story short, we saw how that kind of impacted our missions work here. And so once we kind of split from them, we actually left a lot of money on the table because they wanted to go in a certain direction that did not fit. It's a really long horrible story, but long story short, we stuck with, what we felt God was leading us to, but ultimately, like, also our knowledge of the community. And so we've kind of been fine tuning that in these last few years. And so this class really kind of made me look even more intently at the process of developing ministry, by listening, by looking at why are things the way they are? Why is the community poor? Why do we see more single mothers? Why do we see unemployment? Why do we see more people on governmental assistance? Why do we see, what are what is the context? What are the nuances in the community that create the situations that we see, as opposed to just, saying, oh, we've got hungry people, let's develop a ministry to feed them. Or, oh, we've got people that don't have a GED, so let's partner with organizations that will help them get the GED. So basically my exploration is kind of specifically looking at the cycle, and developing, kind of comparing, but also like fine tuning what we're doing, from, not that I have control over that, but just kind of presenting based on the cycle and based on what I've experienced with developing like a sound system for, really looking at behind the scenes of developing effective missions in the urban community. I hope that makes sense, but it does to me. But
That's 6 minutes so far. Anything else you want to say about the outline, or just let us take a scan of it? And
okay, well, I guess I'll just go through the outline. So I want to start with, what does priestly listening look like in this particular context in the urban community? What does that look like? Typically, people do, the statistical data in terms of census data, like who lives in the community, right? That's important to know. But also there's another aspect of, when we look at the why behind things, there's another aspect of actually like living among the people, and getting to know people person to person. And, I want to look at why the church, specifically the local church, needs to focus on priestly listening, whether it's overcoming personal bias. And as I said earlier, discovering those specific issues within the context that maybe the census data or, research doesn't address or doesn't understand outside of the culture. So that's one of the things, and also how to develop a foundation, obviously through prayer, doing research as mentioned, but also like actually, again, it's kind of simple, but just creating opportunities to get next to people and get to know them beyond, because you can have a paper that says this is what's going on, but you don't actually know the people that live there. And so that's what I kind of want to explore on, how to develop a system of doing that, I guess, to make effective ministry. I know I kind of...
I didn't mean to cut you off. I was like,
no, you're okay.
Okay. Questions, anyone? Or observations?
I know it's kind of rough.
Buddy?
I guess I was intrigued by your interaction with the affluent white church and some of the failures and just being able to walk away. In this, are you going to create kind of the ideal relationship to engage with people from outside the community, or?
I think it's important, yes, but also like I want to look specifically. The partnerships are important, I believe, as the body of Christ. And I do want to explore that, but I also want to explore the idea of having a vision for the church that you're at. Because if you don't have a clear understanding of, you know, the context that you're in, and you partner with another church, and that church has a stronger team or system in place, and you're unsure and they're sure, it can easily be swayed or changed to meet what they're wanting to do. And so yes, but also like I want to more so focus on like the context of whatever local church you're part of, or not you, but the reader.
Anybody else? Questions?
I have a quick one. So I worked in a urban setting for a little bit before this job, and it was really my first exposure. So I was doing a lot of priestly listening without knowing what that meant. So I was just curious, how, like, when you start the listening process, are you going and are you interviewing people? Are you like grabbing data? One of the things I did was I went and interviewed some of this like local public school administration to try and understand their experience over the last like 10 years. So I guess I'm just curious if you could help me understand like where you're drawing stuff from.
Basically, I'm not doing research, I guess, in terms of like a lot of this. I guess I'm comparing more so what we've already done, and kind of seeing, you know, what we've done successfully based on, you know, Osmer's cycle, but also where we've fallen short and what are some ways that that we can pivot from those kind of errors into a more effective, more effective, I guess, sense of listening, to really understand what's happening. Because sometimes, you know, you can, especially in ministry, it's easy to, even with researching and getting data, to kind of impose what you think is needed. And it's not always effective, because even if you think it's needed based on certain things, it may still not be effective because it's not the actual need. There may be a deeper need that is impacting what you see, if that makes sense. So not so much I'm not so much interviewing people necessarily. Originally I wanted to interview people. I think I'm just going to do more of a comparative piece or paper.
In some ways, Kendra, I'll go ahead and say this. You have a good place to start. So here, the first full sentence of your second paragraph is a pretty clear thesis statement, where you say priestly listening is a foundational requirement for effective urban missions. That's content. I mean, you're picking a fight. You're going to say it's not going to be effective urban missions if you're not doing priestly listening. So it is a key claim, is one way to think about that. And then you go, because it allows the local church to be steeped in the environment and to develop eyes and ears to see and hear what the community members are dealing with, as opposed to assuming one's own bias. And so in a way, you got inside that sentence a way of making an argument for a research paper on the practical theology of priestly listening. If you hear that language. You could start, and I'm just going to coach you for a second. You can sort of start the paper with the context that you just mentioned. You might not want to make too big a deal of it. I don't want you to get lost in the hedgerows of the problem between the ministry and the affluent white church. But you might ask, has there been any research that you could, again, triangulate with that where other churches of affluence have had similar problems? And in the community development literature, there's a whole field of Christian community development. You know, has this been a kind of recurring problem? So it's not just somebody can't come back and say, well, that's just because your dad's ministry is just hard to get along with. But you're going, no, this is a real problem. See, and then if you think of priestly listening, not just as Osmer's first point in the wheel, but more along the language of practicing theology. This is a kind of practice that in urban ministry has to happen again and again and again. It's not just once and you're done, then now you're asking yourself from a theological standpoint, so where has this been emphasized as well? Whether they called it priestly listening or not, are there certain sort of theological talking points, if you will, as well as practical considerations to do that says, no, this is what ministry is really about. It's learning to listen well. And so even people like Jean Stevenson Mosser, for instance, when the book that we read of her and some of what she argues might fit into this conversation. But you may find a couple of articles that just begin to talk about, I may not use the language priestly listening, but what does it mean to really practice being present in the midst of people in urban ministry and make a difference? And you're just building an argument for why this practice is so important. You've already mentioned the Holy Spirit. So, a pneumatology of listening could be a part of that as well. I'm not asking you to go out and read 5 books on the Holy Spirit, but it's more, has anyone talked about how do you really discern how the Spirit is at work in these kinds of settings? And what you're really doing is you're making the argument at the end more around the why and the how of the first 2 elements of your outline. And if you can get down to how do we develop consistency, that's fine, but you don't have to. I mean, if you can finally convince people for the sake of this class that the most important thing is they really do need to exercise this as a practical theology practice in urban ministry, then you've done your job. And then if you can provide ways at the end to say, then this is what it might look like, that's enough, I think, to complete the paper. I mean, time you got to the 3rd section of how do we develop consistency, now we're talking about 2 papers instead of 1. So I'd rather slow you down and get you to the point that you can say, this is why it's really important, both from a ministry standpoint, but from a theological standpoint. And this is how we can kind of cultivate that disposition and be done at the end of the paper. Then I think Stephen would probably say, good, if you do that, then when it comes to the laying it out into an outline of teaching it, I can help you there. But I just don't want you to have to try to do too much in the paper.
Okay.
Does my comments make sense to you? Let me just check.
Yes, very much so. That
Okay.
helps me a lot.
Yeah, the good news is, and some people do, some people don't. There's a very clear thesis, which is that you've already picked a fight. That's my language, not yours. I'm saying, look, if the one thing you need to know and understand if you're going to do urban ministry is you got to practice priestly listening on a regular basis. And this is why. Bop, bop, bop. And then you lay out, and this is why, not only from just a results base, but also because this is what the Spirit of God is trying to get us to do. I mean, so one way to think about it. Then you're making an argument for why that practice is important in urban ministry, both from a practical but also a theological perspective. And both of them are important to me, but that you were able to make the argument both ways. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes.
That will mean when you kept saying I don't want to do research, where Delmy is doing more ethnographic research, experiential research. The other kind of research is the funded wisdom that's out there, which is just articles or chapter in a book, or looking for things that might be helpful to reinforce your argument, which we do for any kind of paper. And Ward was pretty clear that you need to make that transparent before it's all said and done. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, I went longer that time, but I think we're doing okay for time. So any other questions or comments? All right, one of the drive-bys, I'll go ahead and mention this. I think I provided it for everybody at the beginning of the semester, but if not, I've got videos on how to write a research paper and even how to write one where you're doing a straight up kind of research paper, which Ward is assuming this is, and so am I, or how to do a review of literature. So I will make sure you have access to those links rather than spend a whole lot of time in class tonight sort of explaining that. it's probably just as boring as what are outcomes and why should I write them? Those of you who actually painfully went through that one. But at least if you're kind of new to writing, particularly at NTS, there's some guidelines there, including one video on the kind of things that tend to trip up students to keep in mind. Okay. All right. I don't have a name on the top of this one. Is it Deanna? Let's see. No, Stephen, I think this one's yours on the experiencing homelessness. Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So my project came out of my case study. And as we were going through the case study gave me homework because it was a case study based on a situation at our church. Our church is dealing with
Stephen, I can't see your, for some reason, I can't see your
Same
outline. Can
here.
anybody else see it?
It says it started screen sharing, but there's nothing showing.
So it's probably pulling off a different screen. I hate it when it does those kinds of things.
how about now?
There you go.
Yeah, bingo.
All right. Now I got to start all the way over. Thank you for catching that. So out of our case study and out of our church's situation of having homeless people, or people experiencing homelessness, kind of stay on our property and setting up camp essentially on the church property because of our location. We're in the first tier suburbs, and there are a lot more homeless people that are going to the suburbs to stand on the corner and collect money. And so right now in the suburbs, especially around here, somebody flying a sign can collect about $250 a day just by standing on the corner. And so that's attracting more people out to the suburbs. As we have had more people stay on the church property, there was a difference in opinion on how to react and treat and work with the people that we're encountering on the church property. So as a result of the case study and working with our pastor, one of the things that we decided we'd do is develop guidelines for how to engage and approach these men that are men and women experiencing homelessness. So my project in this document is supposed to walk through different guidelines, as well as providing backup from other books and research and the Bible, scripture on how to engage and what's our biblical and what's our response as people representing Christ. And we should respond in love. In our case study, since all of you should remember, we had an expert come from the local shelter, the director of the shelter that our church or that our district helped support. And he came to our church and gave us some really good resources and examples on how, the start of how to respond. So this isn't a copying, but it's using some of the things that he started laying out, and then he left it to us to identify what is our approach. And so our first approach is treat people in dignity, with dignity, because we are all created in the image of God. We are all given the same grace through salvation, and we all have a place at the table. As we work with people, they are not lesser than us. They are our equals. And they just happen to either be in a situation or have, we have to try and help identify where they are in their crisis. Either their life is a crisis or they have a momentary crisis. So as a church, we have to learn how to respond to that. As we respond, though, we have to be able to do it through relationship and help people, help build that relationship. And that's one piece that our church was really missing, was that we had a lot of people that wanted to respond or react, but not through relationship. And so as we, the guidelines, we want to be emphasize that relationship is a key part of engaging with the community and with people that some see as troublesome, but at the same time, they are our responsibility because they're our neighbors. And then in the guidelines as well is stating the consistency and rules. With relationships, we need to have parameters, but then we need to be consistent. So, pastors are mostly, over generous and don't want to hold people to it. So how do we have the pastor who wants to give exceptions and love, extra, and then the board member who is also our insurance agent, who sees this person staying on our property as a liability, finding that, the consistency and rules to help both of them. So it's rules for our rule follower. That rule is that we have to have relationship, and then rules for our pastor is that we have to have parameters. And so identifying those and setting those ahead of time, and then consistency on how we implement and how we move forward as a church body. And then it's not just reacting to people staying on the property, or it's not just saying that this is how we get rid of the people. We spend so much time and effort trying to attract people to come into our church. So if we have people literally staying on our property, why are we trying to have them go away? So how do we engage and help them through a path forward to heal or to move through those crises? And how do we help them to, how do we be an assistance to them, or how do we help transition them to the professionals, the people that are trained and equipped to deal with the deeper problems or those roots? So this project is to help set those guidelines, identify them, and just bring the church body together as we engage our communities and our neighbors that just don't happen to look like us.
Comments, anyone? Questions?
Just kind of in the spirit of the previous presentations, is there a methodology that you're following? Is this more research based or interview ethnographic style?
No, it's not. It's more of, I have some books, and one is using the wheel of how, by articulating the situation, the gist, and then helping the church walk through what is the theology behind these different practices, and then allowing for that revision and redefining at the end. So part of it is just implementing this, what we've learned. Others, collecting other information. I've got some other books on homelessness and some other pieces. So gleaning from all these different resources.
Okay, anybody else?
Even this is great, just like Hendra's. Out of all this that you are going to be doing a deeper dive, from your experience, what will be the most challenging as far as from all the buckets that we're seeing here, the consistency and the rules, the relationship response? What do you think from your experience?
I think the outcome, people are coming at it to receive different outcomes, and each situation, each person is a different method or approach. So trying to build those guidelines to say this isn't a formula that every time we encounter somebody staying on their property, we do step 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we're going to come out with this result. One of the desired outcomes is to get people off our property. The other one is to bring them to the Lord. The other is, hey, let's just build relationship and let the Spirit work through it. So trying to build unity in an understanding that our outcomes cannot just be one or the other. It has to be all of them in a sense. Sometimes it is to get rid of the liability. Some of it is to help them get further down their path. And some of it is salvation, but you can't do one without the other.
And just I'll offer being in the vaccine sector now, as far as what you're looking at opportunities, because I work both with the public and the private sector. The CDC has given and works with the government for specific guidelines where folks within this subgroup can get vaccinated. There is plenty of resources for that. So just thinking of an outcome, what could be another avenue of help. Just if you want to talk offline, we can do that as well, because that's what I'm actually working on right now in the public and private sectors, and how both can intertwine in the midst of all this, just as far as looking at opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Anybody else? Other comments? Okay, a couple of thoughts. And I think part of kind of where Adam was and a little bit of Delmy at the same time. I think one thing to think about as you're doing this, Stephen, is kind of the organization. I mean, sometimes it's a straight up research paper, either built on ethnographic methodology or built on a normal problem, and here's the guideline, and here's the answer, and the research to back up the answer to the problem. I think for you, it's more almost a preamble and then a playbook. There'd be one way to think about how you're doing it, where you are trying to set up a strong rationale for even why the church should do this.
Mhm.
And then it doesn't have to be a very specific guides, but at least a general set of either practices or postures that assure that the church can do it well. So how do you, and one way to think about it in a very broad sense is, how do you assure that this is going to be a ministry to the homeless and not merely a problem that the church has to solve? Almost literally, how do you move them to that ministry mindset would be one way to think about it. And I do think that since you've got those other books, triangulating so that the experiences you're talking about at your church, how they are consistent with broader struggles of dealing with the homeless, how the postures maybe you're asking your church to adopt are consistent with other ways from a theological standpoint the homeless has been addressed. Those would be things to kind of keep in mind as you're sort of triangulate. All of you are going to hear this language, sort of triangulating your particular context against a little bit broader horizon, so that people can kind of get a sense of that you've had a conversation with a broader, at least a broader knowledge base than just what you've experienced in your own place. Okay. All right. Well, we'll do one more. Delmy, I'm watching the clock for you. That's probably not fair, but if you need to check out, you're free to do that, just so you know. I'm recording, by the way, so that if I give prompts, I'm going to throw this up on YouTube, just like I've done everything else, and people can go back and cross tab what I said from that standpoint. All right. Then I think if there is, let's see, Deanna, are you next, I think? Or am I getting, I don't have names on some of these outlines, so I may have,
I think I'm next. Mine was the spiritual formation one.
Okay. All right. Go ahead.
Okay. I'll share my screen. Okay. Can everybody see? Hopefully. Okay. So my project kind of came out of doing the cycle with my last presentation. So since you all have seen it, you all kind of understand. But there was one of my it was in my priestly listening where I talked about that it that I or maybe it, no, I think it was actually my normative view where I talked about how Sunday morning the ecclesiology should be that we're coming together in a celebration of our experiences throughout the week. And so I kind of use this project then to dive into that concept a little bit more. And so if you look through my intro, it's basically that just kind of practically speaking, a lot of our churches exist kind of in this individual like gas up mindset where Sunday morning is supposed to be, you know, kind of puttering out and your energy is leaving and we get together and we have enough energy to make it to next Sunday. But if our like heart as a church is spiritual formation, then to be able to do that is not just an individual experience, but it's a communal experience. And so my thesis says to achieve this, the church must be willing not only to engage spiritual formation on the sidelines, but to integrate it holistically through the life and ministry of the church. The goal should not only be individual spiritual growth, experience, and expression, but communal growth within the body of Christ and catalyzing beyond the life of the church into the greater community and vision for the kingdom of God. So I'm kind of loosely following Osmer's cycle. And so when we get to the interpretive task, it's looking at what is the specific issue of individual expression over communal and missional expression in spiritual formation. So why does the church want to focus on the individual expression? And maybe that kind of leads to some avoidance of intentionally integrating spiritual formation because they just see it as an individual expression. So a lot of my research kind of focuses on when you have a myopic focus on sanctification, it does become individual. But my challenging statement is using Wesley's own quote, which says there is no holiness but social holiness. And so how do we then move into the normative task of making it not just something that we do as like, oh, the women's ministry has spiritual formation, the children's ministry has spiritual formation, and we're all kind of in our own silos, but as a holistic approach of the church. And so the normative tasks that I will employ in this will be the Trinity. So the Trinity, the concept of it invites us into community and relationship. It's kind of our ultimate view of what it means to live in that space. And then also the Missio Dei. So God came so that we can experience him and then show him to the world and live in mission. And then also the ecclesiology and soteriology. So salvation is meant for us not only to experience it, but then to participate in that salvation as well. So moving out of that, then we get to the pragmatic task. So kind of redefining our purposes. If we look at the sanctification, the myopic view of sanctification, it can either become this one and done, or it can become this like very linear. But the model that I'll go off of with spiritual formation is that it's more circular. So how does a church engage the circular process? So yes, spiritual formation is a very individual experience, but as you move through it and become one with Christ, you can't help but then to engage your community, not only your community of believers, but your community at large. And then that then deepens your relationship with Christ, you know, setting you on this cycle of growth into greater relationship there with Christ and with others. The holistic integration that kind of will weave itself in and out will focus in this chapter, and then more faithful leadership. So one of the works that I have been reading is just about how pastors themselves can experience spiritual direction. And so kind of pastors having a pastor and pastors learning how to engage with priestly listening because they are going through their own experiences. And then that can then lead to more faithful leadership in this realm. And then I will then move into a case study. I interviewed Mikhail Levine. So if anybody has paid attention to NTS stuff, she's our camp pastor in residence, and she's awesome. She's actually on our district here in Southwest Oklahoma. And so their church is doing a lot of this, their 5-year church plant. And they were planted with the idea of holistically integrating spiritual formation, that it's the heart of what they do. They follow the liturgical calendar, so it gives them some space and some guidelines in how to do that intentionally. So I interview her just about their normative task, how they integrate theology, what their theology is, some challenges that have presented, some of the mindset shifts that they've had to walk through with their congregation. And yeah, it's just a good interview. So I put it in there that this is doable, that this is kind of a approach that churches can use even in our own denomination. One of the things I'm trying to work out in where to put it is, and probably just in the intro, is that this will be from a Protestant standpoint. That has been my experience, and that's the faith tradition that I'm currently in and ministering within. But I put my bibliography here. These are the 3 main works that I'll be referencing, but I also will probably throw in some additional like articles and academic journals and things like that, just to support different stuff that I'm working through. But that's the bulk of the work.
Okay, that's helpful. Questions, anyone for Dana? Anyone? This happens all the time. Once I start coaching, everybody's going, I'm afraid to ask anything or say anything. Let Dr. Blevins tell us what we're doing right or wrong, and then we'll move on. So that's the only thing I hate about doing this way instead of doing it in small groups. I will say where you have Michaela's fine. If you want to have it as a kind of comprehensive expression of what this might look like, you could have her as a dialogue partner throughout. Normally, practical theology tends to err one of 2 ways. We either argue theoretically, and we don't have that kind of constant sort of practical conversation going on, or we get lost in the hedgerows of the practical side of how to do something without keeping theology in our ears, so to speak. From what I'm seeing, other than sort of naming the problem early about worship, this is not so much a theology of worship paper, but it really is what happens when community and relationship become important. And I like your kind of play on sanctification, by the way you're thinking about that. So you might want to just wrestle with, does Michaela work best at the end as a kind of summary expression of this? And if you do, just mention that early in the introduction of the paper. Or as you're writing it, if you go, I wouldn't mind having some kind of concreteness, and you already have the interview done, then you might think of ways you might incorporate her early instead. So I'll leave that to you, Deanna, but that's the fact you've got that kind of triangulation this time, not just to the written documentation, but to someone who's actually trying to practice this, I think is a really good way of utilizing that kind of a resource in this class. So that I just think it's going to be more how in the final writing it works best for you. Okay.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. I was wrestling through that, and I know Osmer put it at the end, so that's kind of why I did, but it's helpful to know that I can integrate it, because I probably would prefer that. So yeah, I'll think through that more.
It gives you, as long as you set it up in the introduction why you're doing that. Osmer, remember, sometimes he starts with a case study. I mean, he starts with a practical experience, and then he just demonstrates what he would do from a theological and through research, how he would triangulate things to make that case study deeper, richer, and bigger. But there are times when you're working on something more like Miroslav Volf, for instance, where you're arguing for a particular perspective, but then being able to give not just illustration, but give concreteness to it is something for you to be thinking about from that standpoint. okay?
Yeah.
But if you at the end say, I would just as soon leave this whole as a unit in the paper and then wrap it up with a conclusion, I won't have a problem as long as you know why you've chosen to do that, okay?
Is that something that if I do integrate it throughout, it would make sense to put in an appendix just typed out linearly, or does it
You
matter?
could- You could, a lot of times, and at least Delmi's still, she may have stepped away, so, but I'll go ahead and say this. Whatever you do, make sure you contact Michaela and just ask her permission to use this in the paper.
Yeah. Yeah, I emailed, so I have her permission over email to use the
Okay.
content.
And having a permission is fine, and you could even add that as an appendix in the paper, just so that should somebody look at this paper, because I'm going to ask, we share our papers with each other, but so if somebody were to, for some reason, see this 5 years from now, they'll know that, yes, she actually did get permission for that kind of thing.
Okay, perfect.
So
Thank you.
I'll let you make that decision. It's good to have the transcript as a whole, but sometimes that's a lot of work. So if you don't have the transcription resources to do that, you can just make it available. I mean, one of the citations is available as a podcast or available as a MP3 file, and just notate that, and that's available from that standpoint. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
All right. I'm looking at the clock. Let's do one more and then we'll take a break. Okay. So if nothing else, Ori, I think you're next. Am I right on that?
I don't know, but I'll go.
All right.
Okay. Can you guys see?
Starting up. There it goes.
There you go. There we go.
Right. Okay, so I'm doing my thesis about enculturation in the worship service and in a cultural Christianity. What the Vietnamese Catholic Church has done, and how it could be how can be utilized, what can we learn from it in regards to enculturating traditional Christian practices and the gospel message, particularly within a Khmer Cambodian context. So in my intro, I'm going to talk about what enculturation is. Basically, it's what Nazarenes call contextualization. Just contextualizing the gospel, contextualizing Christianity, so it takes on the forms of the culture, using symbols and messages that speak to the heart language of its people. So the intro will be that. I've got quite a long thing here from, but you have it so you can read it later if you want. And then the next section will be how can Vietnam's experience with enculturation inform Cambodia's experience. So the reason I chose Vietnam is because they're on the forefront of contextualization within Christianity. The churches, while being very, they're on the forefront while being very intentional about orthodoxy, and intentional about avoiding syncretism. So I chose Vietnam because, one, they're bordering. They both had relatively large Christian populations before communism and dictatorship took over Southeast Asia. So I think there's a commonality there of shared persecution. So I know the thing is that the cultural destruction of Pol Pot has left a void of cultural expression, and Western culture is starting to fill that void, and they're being homogenized to Western culture, and so missionaries are often either wittingly or unwittingly perpetuating that, and so empowering the local pastors to create a Christianity that through the guidance of the Holy Spirit that speaks to its own people is significant, and that's what the Jesuit priests did in Vietnam in the 1500s, and that was unheard of. It was the first time since the Apostolic Age, before the Middle Ages, that had been done. And so they're right next to each other. They were both under colonial rule by France, and so they both understand what colonialism is and the how to navigate that. I also pitfalls to avoid, strategies to emulate. These are the reasons I chose Vietnam. To Vietnam's experience as a way to kind of go forward with what an ethnographic liturgical study would look like for Cambodia. And also Oklahoma City is the highest Asian population in Oklahoma City is Vietnamese. And so there's a significant amount of resources as well, just by being here. So I was able to get done multiple interviews and go to multiple different Catholic churches and masses to see how things are done. So the ethnographic study, I went to mass at Our Lady of Perpetual Help Cathedral. It's the cathedral of the Oklahoma City Diocese, and 60 or 70% Vietnamese population congregation. I went to St. Charles Borromeo, which is about 30 to 40% Vietnamese population. And I went to St. Andrew de Luc Catholic Church, which is about 95% Vietnamese. That's the one I didn't understand anything because it's in Vietnamese. But I was familiar enough with the Mass in English to kind of know what was going on and see the different levels of intercultural play going on, because you have different. At St. Charles Borromeo, there was a Hispanic population and a Polish population and a Vietnamese population, and so how did the Mass look there? The cathedral was 40% white, 60% Vietnamese. So it was in English, but all the icons and stuff, and it was very Vietnamese English Mass. So the things I noticed were the chanting. There is specific. It's called I think it's called Quat Dim. It is a chanting of it's the Lord's Prayer that isn't found in other masses, and it uses traditional like folk and Buddhist chanting. I did iconography. I saw iconography and musical instruments, investments, symbolic gestures and postures of prayer. And then I did interviews with multiple different Vietnamese Catholics and one Cambodian Catholic. The Cambodian Catholic population is very small, so it was hard to find someone. But I got a wide variety of opinions of the different levels of contextualization and enculturation within the Mass in Vietnamese, both negative and positive. And so I'm excited to include that in my findings as well, and kind of figure out what it would look like in Cambodia. Just try to, and I bounced all of these ideas off of. I started doing research about what chanting would look like in a Cambodian service. What kind of cultural chanting is there already in place? What can we make iconography using traditional art styles? What kind of musical instruments and traditional imperial dresses and can we use for vestments, that kind of thing. And I bounced all of this stuff off of Cambodian Catholic and to see what he said. And but the conclusion will be that regardless whether it's ethnographic musicology or intercultural enculturation, it takes two to go through it. It takes two to tango, right? So it's one of those things where I, as an outsider, can come prepared to present and do my best to present the gospel in a way that makes sense to the people that God has called me to be. God has called me to preach the gospel to, and then let the people themselves form and create through the guidance of the Holy Spirit what is right and what's wrong. I mean, what can be baptized from the culture and what needs to be thrown away, because ultimately I'll always be an outsider. And so, I mean, as a missionary, it's my job to come prepared and to have these conversations throughout the entire process, and not in a patriarchal or a parental or colonial kind of way. So that's it. I do have a couple of. This is one of the icons I was thinking about trying to figure out how to do some Cambodian stuff with. So one of Christ and one of the Theotokos. This is Our Lady of China.
We're not
So-
seeing that, Ori. Just so
You're
you know.
not?
No.
Okay.
I've just seen your paper.
Nice. Well, never mind then. It's very pretty. You'd enjoy it, but
We're going to take a break. So if you want, let's go ahead and finish. And then if you can throw it up on the screen when we break, that'll be fine. So we'll have that at that point. Questions, anyone for Ori? No? No questions? Should never said the word break. I'm just dumbest thing in the world to do. Ori, the only thing I would say in this, because we got 3 or 4 pretty big moving parts. You're doing the whole history of both Vietnamese Christianity in some ways. I mean, not comprehensive, but you're dealing with that, comparing that to Cambodian history. And then you've done all this work engaging Vietnamese Catholics. So I don't want you to feel like you need to do a whole lot more. Probably the one piece that's just bugging me is, so what is it within Jesuit theology that created the space for this to happen with the Vietnamese people that is the underlying set of theological assumptions that would have to be at work for it to actually replicate itself with the Cambodian people? And so somewhere in the paper, either at the bridge point or toward the end, that 2 to tango, I'm sitting here going, why is it that theology worked that well the first time that would still have to be a theological governance so that we don't misapply what we're trying to do the second time around? So that would be about the only other thing for you to wrestle with. My hunch is it will bubble up inside the writing, but taking time out to make that what was the underlying theological assumptions within Jesuit theology that allows for better enculturation, better than say other models, making sure that shows up in the paper is probably going to be important from that standpoint. Does that make sense to you?
yes, thank you.
Okay. And I will say this, and I was going to look up his email. Phil, do you know Phil Troutman? Does that name ring a bell? Those
Yes,
of you
I've,
that
I've,
do-
I've had extensive conversations with Phil.
Okay, all right. So I was wondering if you had a good conversation partner. Phil's a friend at this point in his journey, so just so you know that. So, but that doesn't mean he can tell stories about me. Let me just put that on notice, okay? You might be able to, but that's another story. Well, it's 7:24 and we've still got quite a few to go. Why don't we take a 10-minute break, no more than that? Mainly because I'm looking at Becky. We are not going to leave Becky out in the cold tonight. So I hope you hear that from me. So let's just take a brief 10-minute break, grab some caffeine if you need it, bathroom break, whatever you need, and we'll see you back here at 7:35, okay? We'll go ahead and get started again. And Sam, I think you're next in line.
Awesome. Can everybody see that okay? Okay, perfect. So, last
Barely
week-
hear you though.
You can barely hear.
Yeah.
Just wondering if that'd be a problem. Any better now?
You're still a little bit in a boom box, so just speak up.
Okay, can I try one thing and just take out these?
Yeah. Unplug. There you go. Yeah, put it on your. Can't hear you at all. Wait. Try it again.
Okay, what about now?
Yes.
We're good now?
Yes.
So I like Stephen, and I promise I'm not copying Stephen, but is very similar to my case study, and kind of rallying off that. Really, it's an overview and outline of racial reconciliation, specifically in a very real context I'm currently in. The context of the situation, it's a compassionate ministry working in a very socioeconomically lower class. The community consists specifically a majority Black and Hispanic and Latinx communities pocketed within an area of Oklahoma City. And in this compassionate ministry, the main ministry outlets during the week include food resource and medical resource. And it's all partnered through the local church. And so in this pocket, in this context, basically there is a severe pocket of food insecurity and medical healthcare insecurity. And so it's surrounded in essence by suburban neighborhoods. So you have this context of suburbia, Oklahoma, and then within about a 4 square mile, a severe pocket of poverty, so much so that it ranks top 3 when it comes to single father households, like you were talking about, Kendra, and yours. It also, in poverty rate overall, and food insecurity and gang violence, this community ranks top 3 in all of Oklahoma City. And it's surrounded by suburban households, very well-known wholesale businesses. And then there's this neighborhood right in the middle of it. And so this food center, specifically leaving out right now the medical clinic, this food center is doing its best job to tackle the growth of food insecurity during COVID. And the problem and the beautiful aspect is that this food center, we're blessed with volunteers from the inside the community, but also outside. And so what we're seeing is that the goal is to, create this diverse and mutually loving community that learns, that serves, that grows alongside one another through the love of Christ. And so my thesis, though, is to do this, we believe we must have extensive cultural bias, cross-cultural discipleship, and community education training in order to understand our neighbors better and how to serve and love our neighbors better. And so really when it comes to the overall focus and gist of this situation is you see that there's Within the community, the goal of any compassion ministry in this area is that the community takes ownership. And so once the community takes ownership, there's a sense of pride, there's a sense of dignity, there's true needs being met, as the community knows the needs better than anyone on the outside. But also there's outside members coming in and experiencing this mutually loving, grace given and grace received, as there's people from a suburban population coming in to a very urban population and working alongside one another. But the challenge, of course, in this situation is that when you have people coming from an outside situation, there can be a lot of savior complex coming into a situation, believing that I have the solution, I have the answers, I've seen this in another context, I've read enough books, I've watched enough movies, I've listened to enough podcasts. Now I'm going to bring this agenda into this community and I'm going to fix them. And so what this thesis is ultimately trying to tackle is that in order to develop a community holistically, we must first understand the community to begin with, and the relational side of who the people are, but also there has to be extensive cultural bias training, cross-cultural discipleship on all formats, both outside the community and inside the community, and education overall of what this community we're serving in looks like in order for us to fully understand how to serve with dignity, with equity, with justice, and with love. And so from the outline piece, the intro, what does a diverse, hoping to tackle, what does a diverse and mutually loving community look like? Really, this question is hoping to challenge, what does it look like to not just have a charitable organization that offers food and then that's the cutoff, but what does it look like to have a community where needs are being met all around? So from our community standpoint, food is the segue into 800 different needs. So how can we tackle this basic resource while also then from a relational standpoint, we won't be able to understand the other needs unless a friendship is built. And then once that friendship is built, then how do we go about in a dignified way, establishing systems and structures in order to figure out how can we meet needs to holistically walk alongside our community and grow together. And so the why behind it all is really the central question of why is loving our neighbor even important to begin with? And so gonna bring references, including the book Bridges Out of Poverty, into this discussion, into that as reference of how does it look to not charitably help, but also how to not help without hurting. And also what does toxic charity look like? And what does domestic missions look like in a way that actually could be harming the community rather than helping? And so through that why, we're gonna tackle in this paper about what are some common stereotypes that have been used in this community as we have in this volunteer team, outside community members and inside community members working together, and that there's stereotypes on all sides towards the other party. And so what does it look like? What do stereotypes look like? What are some biases that outside community members are coming in that are then being projected upon our community members that are receiving resources? And what does a microaggression look like? What does a microaggression look like in the sense of just our communication? And so then we're going to talk about situations and conflicts that have happened within this organization that have resulted in disunity and not the love of God, but also what are the opportunities and healing that can come from this in the sense of our structures and our systems. And so the how leads right into that. What is our systems and structures? What are some of their systems and structures that are causing prejudiced actions? And so one base we're going to look at is volunteer assessment and overlook. When someone comes in, how can we train from the get-go who we are and who we're not? But then also the structure of our food center operation. From the moment a client walks in, they're our first priority. How can we love and serve them the best? And then how will we sustain this through our orientation, through our culture, with the goal being that both members from outside and inside experience a mutually loving community. There's dignity and empowerment within the operation, and more education about the neighborhood and its people from the people. And the language changes from this community we're serving to our community we're serving in. And so the conclusion would just be the challenges that are going to come with that. What are some action steps to take with a goal in mind? And that's the end of the presentation.
Questions, anyone?
I have a question. I guess knowing your specific context pretty well, how do you like, I guess I'm just interested in kind of understanding, like, practically, how do you engage really like young, college age, really well-intentioned students who want to do good, you know what I mean? Like there's a gentle balance with being like calling it out, but like being gentle. I guess just practically it's helpful for me to know like kind of where you're going with that.
That's a question I'm asking my lead pastor consistently. So best way to describe it is I'm learning in that too. From our experiences, one thing we realize is assessing who it is that's coming over. And usually the first question we ask is, why are you serving? Why? And usually from that answer, we can tell what the reason behind it is. And then if that reason is very self-interest, we're going to still use your energy and good intentions in a maybe non-client exposure way. But also if the intentions are, we truly believe in this, then we're going to provide opportunities to slowly engage them with our clients. The tough challenge we're facing with that is also for the person who might come over with a self-interest or maybe framework that might not align with our mission. We still believe the same grace can soften their heart and open their mind. And so what we'll do is we'll place them with one of our team leaders who's within the community. And the grace that our team leaders have of walking some of our college students through, even one of them right now, from a very, very non-urban culture with kind of a savior complex. There's discipleship truly happening from the community member within to the outside member of the community. And I think that's the goal. It's never perfect, but the goal with someone who's coming in maybe ignorant to the mission is to actually get them to be discipled by a community member.
Okay, Sam, I'm gonna slow you down. Your answer is taking up all the time. So,
Sorry.
No, you're fine. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
That may be an
go too far.
offline conversation. So
I
Sure.
tend to do that. My fault.
okay, two things I'll go ahead and note is the way you've got it. One is I'm looking for the theology that undergirds some of this. Obviously, in the why is loving our neighbor important, a part of that. Thinking about Osmer's will, it might be interesting. Partly, I couldn't figure out when you say the how. I could not figure out whether that's an assessment or whether that's an intervention. In other words, are you underneath that, you are assessing what you've already got in place, or are you saying we need to do assessment as part of the intervention to do this well? So I hope you hear my qualifier in that. And the reason is, if the how is how you will implement, then I would put the goals before the how. And so one way you might think about that is that's the theological vision that you're driving toward. And then the how is the strategic, thinking about Osmer's will, the strategic way in which you will attempt to do that. So rather, you can do tons of other things in the conclusion, but it's just a different way of setting up a kind of theological, goals normally we set up before we actually, so we know we're going to hit them before we come up with the interventions. And so it might be good to think about, if you organize this paper in such a way that you use the goals as a theological vision for what you want to see happen, and then suggest under the assessment and sustainability what it needs to happen in order to strategically to make that go forward. Does that make sense to you?
Thank you.
So it's it really is just paying attention to Osmer's wheel and letting the goals be the theological norm, if you will, at the bottom of the wheel as you're thinking strategically moving forward. The only other thing I would say, how much of this needs to be just part of the intro. So, I mean, the why could be that sagely wisdom component, but one way to think about it is how you keep both imperative versus descriptive together. So you're going to argue we need to love our neighbor, but you're going to observe that there tends to be microaggressions and biases that tend to pop up regardless, and making sure that when you're making an assertive statement versus when you're making a descriptive statement, that you pay attention to tone from that standpoint. And I think that section will probably be the one place that you'll have to really be careful. You'd almost put why is loving our neighbor one paragraph, maybe then a different paragraph that starts talking about some of the challenges that come out from underneath that. And how much of that you need either even in the introduction versus expanding on it here, it's just something to kind of wrestle with in the writing. Okay. All right. For the sake of time, I'm going to keep moving. I normally ask for a response, but you might take 3 minutes, so we'll just keep going on. I hope I can pick on you guys. I mean, I hope we've got a friendship as well as a professorial relationship here. Okay. So I think Adam, you're next. Am I right? Can't hear you, dude. I'm Mike's off.
This is odd. 1 second. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Is it the paper?
Yes. You mean the computer guy is having problems on
Yes.
display?
All right. I put actually my open outcome on here just to keep reminding myself what it is, because I found as I progressed through that it was very easy to kind of try to shape what further shape and maybe even steer away from what I was initially intending. So I recognize that this is very much you let us lay the trap and now we're trapped in it to work our way out type thing. So I recognize that. So my open outcome is very much interested in how lay and clergy handle change in ministry. Osmer's fourth task of servant and the servant leadership model within that. In addition to some of the other classes I'm taking this semester, I'm fully taking advantage that there's a lot of parallels in there, is going to shape this paper quite a bit. Now I will say I did fail in 2 ways in this, and I'll just state them right out here. First, at first glance, my thesis looks very obvious, basically change in ministry that it doesn't matter who initiates the change or who drives the change in the church. That seems to be immaterial, but unless there's synergy between clergy and lay leadership, it's almost doomed to fail or doomed to struggle anyways. And really at first glance, that just seems really obvious. And that wasn't my initial read here. My methodology was I took some pages from Moschella in the ethnography, and I really wanted to do a comparative puzzle of examining 3 different contexts and seeing if I could pull some truths out of that. Now, as I say that, I understand that 3 contexts don't make a universal truth, but at least I could try to triangulate something together here. So very much this research is influenced by Osmer's fourth task there. There's actually a book in the other class, Dr. Blevins' class on innovation theology. We're actually running through the section on change, and that's been hugely inspirational to me. And then certainly Moschella's comparative puzzle, and I'm using a series of 3 ethnographic interviews. The interviews themselves were very interesting. Initially, what I wanted I wanted a clergy interview, I wanted a lay interview, and I wanted an outside interview outside the denomination. And this is where my second failure came in. As it turns out, I got my clergy interview. I interviewed a lovely couple, and actually Rachel knows them out of our Medicine Hat church here in Canada. My lay interview that I wanted, I'd completely forgotten she went and got ordained. So she's actually clergy now. So that's unfortunate. And then my outside interview, I thought, okay, well, at least he's a lay context. So first, I used the Glenview Church of Nazarene. The Canada West District actually employs a children's ministry director to coordinate a lot of the and equip and resource the various children's ministries on our district. That was a need. And then actually through a work contact, he used to be my former boss actually. He is the chairman of the council for the St. Albert Canadian Reformed Church, a very large church just outside of Edmonton. So that was my outside. And I thought maybe he could be my lay interview. And in their context, and I'll go into it in the paper, there are two councils that kind of, they're very, their polity is actually very interesting. The two councils, you have deacons and elders, and he's the chairman of the committee that are considered elders. They consider themselves clergy, even though they're not ordained in the traditional sense that we have. And in fact, clergy, like as a pastoral role, is more of almost a staff function than anything. Everything else happens through lay ministry. So what we would consider to be lay ministry anyways. So I kind of failed on all three fronts there. I wanted clergy, lay, and outside, and I got clergy outside. So we'll see how that comes out here. So some of the observations that I was able to draw out was changes that were perceived as positive really had that really high lay involvement, whether or not lay was driving the change or just involved in the change set out by clergy. It didn't really seem to matter. And changes that were perhaps unfavorable or difficult, really the clergy were left high and dry in this. And again, I don't want to posit a universal truth that this is always going to be the case, because I don't think I can based on three instances here. A couple sidebars that I was interested in was really getting a sense of what people thought of who's responsible to even set the vision of a ministry. Is it clergy, or is it lay, or is it both, or neither? And there was absolutely no consensus on that. I think I had 5 different answers in 3 interviews. So that was interesting. And one other rabbit hole I almost went down, and this is where having my outcome was helpful, is I recognize that as I'm going through these interviews, that these contexts aren't necessarily aware that they're going through their own process, like Osmer's wheel. They certainly wouldn't recognize that in a more formal sense. But what happens if they're stuck in a particular task? Again, they wouldn't recognize it as such. What would that look like? Or what would it look like if you skipped a task? Like, and I'm kind of borrowing Wolf's malfunctions of theology here. Maybe malfunctions of the practical theology wheel. I'm not sure. So I might try to work that in towards the later half of the paper there. And that's my outline right now.
Any questions, anybody?
So, and looking at your the third guy, the third interviewer, you're talking about how he, in their tradition, he's considered clergy. I mean, you said it is a failure, but I think offering an alternative definition of clergy and lay and their roles, I think that actually enriches what you're trying to communicate more than saying that it's a failure just based on labels. So, I mean, that would be my observation, is that use that as a strong point rather than looking at it as a failure.
That's fair. Yeah, it's more of a failure of what I set out to do is not what I ended up with. And that, I didn't have a clear direction other than I wanted to look at change between clergy and laity in ministry. So I guess I can't say that I failed in that, but certainly it wasn't what I expected.
And Adam, just so you know, you can buy a vowel on that. I mean, I know a number of people who, if they're not familiar with the tradition, would really be surprised by that within the Reformed, or even as we understand presbyters and other Reformed traditions, really has a different feel than the way we think of elder in the Church of the Nazarene. It just has a different kind of thing. So you can get a pass from me. Though I would probably take away part of the grade for using Vincent in this class instead of the other. No, I'm just kidding. So don't panic on that. Other questions? Anybody else? I'll say two things. One is figure out where you want to get your theology into the conversation. Is it a theology of the laity? I mean, would be one way to say about that. I mean, this could be an administrative study of what happens when you don't have team effort inside any organization that includes different deferential leadership. You got me?
Yep, absolutely.
But what is it that you're trying to do theologically, even from either ecclesially, from definition of the church, or theology of change, or theology of the laity? Try to find yourself a couple of conversation partners when you get to that point. And it can come either a little early and kind of how you govern the way you set your questions up, or it can come sort of late toward the conclusion of sort of what does this tell us about a theology of the laity. This is one place where you can kind of do that and then just kind of unpack it from that standpoint. Okay.
That's great feedback. Thank you.
Yeah, just pick your place for that theological. I'll say to you, same thing I'd asked Deanna, but also go ahead and make sure you got at least an email permission that you can share this paper and their comments.
I have signed informed consent forms from all participants.
This is a good thing. This is one reason why I love David Wesley. He just makes my life so easier when he starts pounding people with those kinds of things. But yes, and I'll say this to everybody, having documentation just covers you as well as the institution. We don't have a use of human subjects policy for classes, but I have seen great mistakes made when sometimes something is taken out of context and it comes back to bite someone. So getting that permission is really important.
I had to be especially careful even because one of my interviewees actually knows somebody, or Rachel here in the class. They work together on some other things. So I wanted to be very specific on that.
Okay. And we won't talk about what they had to say about Rachel. You don't have to include that as a part of the study. Okay. All right. I'm going to keep moving just because of the number of people, Adam, but I think you're you've made your methodology clear. And you're kind of leading us down that. So as long as you're sticking to that, just make sure the theology shows up in the room before it's over. Okay.
Thank you.
Andrew, I think you're next.
I think so too. So I'm glad we're on the same page or same screen, whatever. Anyways, let me share my screen. I had to switch. I don't know if you saw, I left and came back. I had to switch devices because I was on my phone this whole time because somebody forgot to charge their iPad. That's the best way to share my screen with this paper. So I just switched at the end of Sam's or Adam's presentation. So let me get there. I'm sharing my screen. Okay. Now you all know that I play Among Us. Okay, anyways.
Now we can't see you, but don't worry about it. We'll watch the screen for now, then we'll come back and get you after the presentation.
Okay.
All right.
So mine is pretty interesting. I was trying to think of something in the practical theology field. I'm like, what's something in ministry that we deal with all the time that maybe we don't have quite the theology of, just a model of. So what does a model of compassionate security look like? Because oftentimes I feel like churches will come up with security plans and things, and they will just say, all right, what keeps us safe, without questioning, any morals of it, any theology behind it, or like any of the reasoning or anything. So basically the thesis is basically, as a church body, our goal is to worship God and build community together, of course. But also we need to be prepared to deal with things if, there are situations, active shooter, something else, I don't know. But also, where do morals fit into all this? And, of course, it doesn't allow us to chase people off from the church. So what we, as our church, hope to accomplish is to provide a safe space for people of any background to worship freely and experience the full power of God for themselves, and inevitably share that with others. It's basically how I plan on this to go, is that, I want to define first, what does compassionate security look like? Basically, what's a role of compassion? What's a role of security, and how do they fit together? Because ultimately, security is always seen as like, locked up behind bars type thing. But like, how can you make it into a good thing that protects? Can be hard at times, but basically, how does a theology of compassionate security go into this? So looking at putting those two things together and defining that first, then figuring out the reason why. So why should we need to develop a plan like this? A lot of people typically develop security plans in response to like a threat that's been there or that they're scared of or something. Whereas we'd like to look at the theology behind it as to why are we doing this? And since we're asking why, then we should also look at, it helps us to understand the reasoning, basically. But we've had situations before, we've had some vandalism and things, but like nothing too major happens in our little corner of the town. Like we're on the other side of downtown. Like by the time people reach us, they're heading out of town at that point. But basically, I think it's also good to have that preparedness. So kind of just mixing all that in there. The how. So I kind of talk in the paper a little bit about what we've already put into place since we've had some situations. Definitely like, we're not going to like leave people alone at the church. Like basically until the last person leaves, there's at least one other person there that is not related to the person. There are some, concealed people in there. But also, how do we keep the church safe? And there are the moral concerns with firearms or things like that. Or, what does a police presence outside, what does that look like? Because if we don't want to deal with firearms, I interviewed a professor that said, maybe law enforcement presence. And I said, well, that doesn't exactly scream, welcome in. So it's like you have kind of that disconnect there. And I kind of talk about that a little bit about, what exactly is going to still bring the people in, because I don't want our security to override our compassion or our reputation in the community. So we still need to be as open as possible, but also safe. So we also look at cameras and windows, or adding more windows in our doors. So like how that kind of works together. But I looked at what we're doing that is compassionate currently, of trying to further God's kingdom here in Indiana, PA. So we've done some of our outreach programs. We partnered with other churches, but we've also started some things of our own, definitely connecting with like the college community and things. We drop our judgments when they walk through the door. One of the main things, I'm going to skip to point number 1 there under the 4th point, that everyone that comes through the door is your people at that point. So whether they've been there all the time or not, that's somebody else you're there to protect, even if they have hostile intentions. Anyone in there is your people, and you're supposed to be looking out for all of them. So we have to stop assuming as well. I kind of talk some about that. but looking out for the safety of everyone is definitely what we're into with that. But basically, by the conclusion, my hope is that I have successfully merged security and like a theology of compassion together to build a mostly solid plan. I know this isn't like the perfect undertaking, but it's something I've wanted to work on, just something that I think is practical in a way that not many talk about. Not many talk about the theology of this and how we're still supposed to be a pretty open church and but also not be vulnerable at the same time. So that's something that is hard, but something that we're working on. So yes.
Okay. Okay, there we go. So we can see you.
As I say, now I'm trying to get back.
And that's a low battery. So as soon as we're done, you may have to switch back to your phone again. Who knows? Before it's all said and done.
Yeah.
Comments, questions, anybody?
So I think it'd be interesting. I know you mentioned the importance of the safety of the congregation. And really, I think maybe the focus, correct me if I'm wrong, is against violent crimes and gun safety, that sort of thing. But I think it would also be interesting to hear if you have any plans to include like children and youth safety, check in, check out programs, or if, for example, with a pandemic, how you can keep everyone safe in that way, or if your focus was only going to be like security in the traditional sense.
To that point, I think it would be smart to add like, children and teen. There's a sad reason that I didn't think of that. We don't have very many. So they're not like in a separate area at this time. As we grow more, hopefully we will get more children and teens, but that's honestly why I did not think of it at that moment. But I definitely think that is a smart thing, even if we don't have them yet, to have in place. That way when we do, like I was talking about the theology of it before, I think it's good to be prepared in that way. So I would agree that that would be a good thing to add. But yes, I was mostly looking at the traditional sense of it. Yeah.
Anybody else? Okay, Andrew, a couple thoughts real quick, looking over your outline, and then kind of one of the questions is, where's your theology? And it looks like about the major place you have that is in A1, your intro would be the place where, what does compassionate security look like? What's a theology of compassionate security? Thinking about Osmer, so hear me from that standpoint, since that's normally at the bottom of the wheel. In a way, if you start with that as your theology, kind of how you're still working the wheel, could or could not be, may or may not be easy to do. So, for instance, if you started with an intro that this is just a challenge, and then you looked at the why, which is sort of the underlying assumptions of why we tend to do security in the church. I mean, I didn't hear anything brand new there, but that's more looking back. So you're in this sort of the sagely wisdom component, and even the how of what you already have in place. You could almost put that up towards your intro and say, so this is what we do. Why do we do it? Well, it's around these situations and vandalism preparedness. And then now you're ready to go into the normative phase, which is, so what does real compassionate security look like? And then if you move to the strategic, how will we keep our church safe? In other words, how does that influence then the way we move forward? What you've done is moved your theology into a much more sort of strategic place in how you're working the wheel in the form of this paper. So I hope you hear the way I've kind of moved from more the descriptive and sort of task and the interpretive task of what's going on now and why are you doing what you're doing now, to the normative task of theology to guide then the future of what you're practicing. So I hope you hear the way that's just reworking your outline to kind of fit Osmer's wheel. What that would do when you get toward the back end of this paper, I mean, one thing you're sort of implying, I'm going to make explicit, is sort of what happens when compassion invades security, but also then what happens when security dialogues with compassion. So what does it really mean to move beyond security into a full compassionate response, which is a lot of what you're talking about toward the end of the paper. So that in a way, what you're doing is arguing your piece, and it's all the same material. It's just the flow of the paper guides the reader through it in such a way they're seeing the practical theology as it unpacks itself. Does that make sense to you? Okay. I do think, I don't know what you're drawing from as theological resources when it comes to that compassionate security, who your theological conversation partners are. I'm just going to gesture back to what Rachel said. There's been some really good work on a theology of child safety and sort of the why we do child safety. And there's been some well-written material around that. So if you're looking for a theology of, I mean, you could just look at theology of compassion and then how that defines security. But if you're looking for triangulation, at least where other people have tried to say, how do we keep people safe, particularly children, and why is that important for us? I mean, from that standpoint, in the way in which we do it, I think you would find some articles, if you will, on child safety that might have at least points of correspondence to what you're trying to argue in this paper. Does that make sense? Okay. So in a way, Rachel was kind of headed the same way I was, but partially because I think we have affinities there when it comes to children's ministry in more than one way. Yeah, just a little. Do you have any questions back to us? Okay. So I mean, I think you're on to something. I do think this is an intriguing topic. I mean, trying to figure out how we talk about church safety and not just have it in a very pragmatic or fearful way. And I do think a lot of churches really wrestle with safety and security teams and how to do that well and without always having a good theology to guide them. So I want you to hear that if you take time to sort of pause at that point of why a compassionate security, you could probably offer some really good insights that could translate to churches that are really built differently than what your church is, but it could still be helpful for them. So don't neglect that component. I mean, I do look at sometimes things that are transportable, and I do think that's one of the key components in your paper. Obviously, safety plans are going to look, security plans are going to look different from one church to the next. But this kind of blending of these, I think, would be really helpful for a lot of churches to take seriously. Okay. All right. Speaking of Rachel, you're next. So everybody doing okay? All right. Well, we're just going to keep plugging away. I think we're getting. Are we getting close? Yes, we are. This is why everybody just let them get anxious and then see where we go from there. Go ahead, Rachel.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
I get a gold star. All right. So my topic was on spirituality and medication-assisted treatment in addiction recovery. Thesis is there, basically persons who are in addiction recovery in my specific region face misunderstandings and hostility towards their decision to receive medication-assisted treatment in their recovery. If you don't know what that is, it is medications that people in recovery can take that will reduce their cravings and help them long-term sort out their behavioral health issues while they're in recovery. So through better understanding of hospitality and the cure care theology, these attitudes will diminish and congregations will become more welcoming to persons in recovery, regardless of their opinions on MAT services. So I don't think I started out in the same place I intended to be, kind of like Adam, but here I am. So outcome to develop an understanding of practical theological considerations in the spiritual lives of persons who are in recovery, focusing on how congregations can partner with programs to become more welcoming to persons in recovery. So sort of how this started was full disclosure, I do work in a treatment facility that has both residential and outpatient services. And I would notice that people who had MAT medications would tend to gravitate towards one church or another church. And I was sort of wondering why that happened. And at the beginning of my career there, several of the counselors told me, well, some churches don't believe that you should be taking medications while you're in recovery, because you need to do it the right way, the hard way, basically, and put the work in. And then other congregations or other groups, Alcoholics Anonymous, NA, they're like, well, if you have that tool in your toolbox, then you should use it. So sort of the situation arose that I was talking to some of my clients, and they told me, you know, I've had this experience, or I've had this negative experience in a congregation, and sort of delved deeper into why. So I sort of followed Osmer's spiral and sort of figuring out what that was. So I had a couple interviews with some clients. I talked to my counselors, and this is at various treatment facilities. And then I have an interview from a clergy member as well. So sort of addressing what experiences they've had. And during that process, I found out some really interesting ideas that churches do have about MAT services. So why is this going on? There's people with preconceived ideas about MAT. They think that you should sober up the right way, put in the hard work. But the theological part of it that I'm really interested in, I think it was Williams that had a part, it was in Volf and Bass maybe, where there's the care of treating someone for a disease and caring for them through that illness, and then the cure part of it. So God should be healing me right away. So I really thought that was interesting, and that's sort of the theological viewpoint that I'm coming at it from. During those interviews, we sort of talked about what it could look like if congregations sort of came behind individuals as they made their, made their treatment plan, what that would look like. So focusing on love and hospitality and that care and cure, and then how we should respond. And in case you didn't notice, I have a pastor who loves Wesley. So steps to action, do no harm, doing the most good possible, and attending to the means of grace, and dealing with persons who are in recovery long-term or short-term for that matter. And then the objective was to create a congregation of hospitality where we can worship together in unity. That's sort of where I'm coming from. I've got some articles that I've pulled up that have been kind of interesting. And of course, I work at the facility, so I've had a lot of great resources as far as texts from the scientific part of it. But that's sort of where I'm at.
Comments, questions, anyone?
More just a comment. I appreciate your work. Our church is adding a care ministry component. And so these are some questions that have come up with how people deal with grief. And so I appreciate the work. I think that it's really important. So thank you.
Anyone else? Rachel, obviously, since you are working in a care facility, how you use names, those interviews, I'm sure, again, getting permission, since this paper could go somewhere, and having that documentation on hand, I would definitely with patience in mind, and obviously change names. I mean, I think I should say this to everybody, but make sure the names are different from that standpoint of the people that you interview. If you think it's necessary, particularly those who might be vulnerable in the conversation. So I do think partially you're taking advantage of the strengths of where you're located. So don't get lost in the science. The science is important. I mean, just to make sure we understand what the medications are and what they do, but make sure the focus stays on what makes for a welcoming congregation in the midst of that. is the bigger question from the standpoint of the practical theological engagement. So, so I think, I do think having enough science so people who go, what is medication assisted treatment? You can not only provide just a definition, but you can kind of give 2 or 3 talking points with a couple of footnotes where somebody could go somewhere and find more information easily will be really important, because this is the kind of work I think even what Deanna said, I could see this actually being used by people around before it's all said and done. And I think the other thing is you've made it very clear through the cycle. Maybe at the bottom where it says create a congregation of hospitality and a congregation where all worship together in unity. My line there is put that objective up a little bit higher. Make sure that's the objective that drives the interventions, not the other way around.
Okay.
And I suspect your outcome, your thesis statement is more of a description than an argument. So I would, even if you were to say that congregations have to have an understanding of the practical theological considerations in the spiritual lives of people. So you're arguing for that. And if they have that a proper understanding, which by the way is fill in the blank, and that's how you build your thesis. So thesis statement is always, what's the one thing that a church or a minister needs, or anybody just needs to know or understand before they can really move forward in doing ministry within this particular challenge. And a good thesis statement comes up with a key contestable claim that just basically says, look, you can't go any further until you really understand this, and this is why. And the why is just to help people really pay attention to what you've discovered is the most important thing. I think that'll show up in the normative section here in the prophetic discernment more than anything else. So that tends to be the case in practical theology. Let that, be sure to let that shine when you get to that point in the wheel. Okay. And tell your pastor he needs to get it done. You know that. So,
He's already asking me to preach so that he can have time to get it done.
Rachel's pastor is working on a D-Min that is a great one. So he just needs to get it done. I'll just go ahead and say this from that standpoint. But so you can tell him I took advantage of the extra minute that we had just to rag on him a little bit.
Sounds good.
As a result of the class. Okay.
Great.
All righty. Becky, I think you're going to take us home, and then I have a couple of general comments at the end. So go ahead and lead out.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, can you see my screen?
Not yet. Let's see if it's coming. Oops. Becky, try it again. You turned off your mic, by the way, just so you know. That happens. Certain things default when you're moving from screen share or not. You've seen me make that mistake so many times by now, you should know. Okay.
Okay. All right. Can you see it?
There we go. Yeah, popped in.
Yeah, that was strange. Like everything froze for me for a second. Okay. So I was similar kind of to what Adam did at the beginning of his outline, is just trying to keep my objective and the assignment in mind as I was kind of trying to flesh things out. And I really started with just the intention of trying to work in interreligious engagement and practical theology in some way, and what an assignment could look like that would achieve that. So kind of within the domain of like public faith, trying to look at multiple religious organizations and their involvement in social justice movements, and kind of taking these all together, all as one, and looking at them, and just kind of not so much as comparing, but just kind of holding them all together as one. And I will say, kind of what I mean by social justice movements is I found myself looking for more of the social justice movements that might be more controversial. So ones that you might see people feeling a little more uncomfortable with, or causing a little more division. I think that just created kind of a deeper, more interesting paper. So I kind of followed the same structure I picked 3 religious groups. And so kind of just did a general, an introduction to the religious organization. So, who they are, where they're from, what their mission statement is, how they choose to describe themselves, but also how they fit into their tradition at large. So, just saying, just because I picked a mosque doesn't mean they're representative of the entire Islam tradition. And so realizing that there are multiple sects that are a part of that. And then I kind of moved into just an overview of their specific social justice participation. So the certain movements that congregation or that group of people find to be important, and looking into what they're doing about it and kind of where they've put their resources. And then moving into kind of the sagely wisdom or that theological reasoning as to, what is driving that social justice participation, and specifically in the tradition that they are coming from. So the first group I picked is actually, so it's an Islamic Center in Plano, Texas. They go by EPIC for short. And, they describe themselves as multi-ethnic, multiracial, multilingual. So a very diverse group of people. It's also a very big center. Even the grounds itself is very impressive, and they do a lot as far as programs and different ministries and things. But kind of on their website and as an organization, not only they have what they call the EPIC Social Services Committee. So those are different services that kind of aim more toward, food disparities and health disparities, things like that. But they also set aside a pillar of social justice. So kind of the plan there is to look into the Islamic tradition, which have multiple pillars of faith, of kind of what they go by as a guiding, I guess, kind of theological stance. And so looking into their interpretation of a pillar of social justice. And with that, I would try to find kind of more kind of key literature that's been written in that tradition. And so there's a report on the American Mosque from 2011. And in that report, they set aside kind of a whole question about social justice and the involvement in those movements, and what would be a faithful response. So that was kind of my first group. The next group I picked was the Central Reform Congregation, I believe in St. Louis, Missouri. And this is a Jewish synagogue. And so, they describe themselves as kind of a vibrant Jewish community. And they're supporting one another in holy ways, pursuing justice and lifelong learning, and providing a shelter of peace. And this group of people, it's very interesting. They're doing what they call a listening campaign, which is a series, like a podcast series, where they sit down with different members of the synagogue and talk about kind of the different passions that they have for certain ministries. And they've also launched, I think it's the Ashrei Foundation, which is going to be a nonprofit that's operating out of the synagogue, focused on social justice work. Specifically, they support the Black Lives Matter movement outright. And so just kind of, I looked at all of that, and I also found, some additional literature it's called A Guide to Synagogue Social Action. So kind of another piece of work within that tradition where they're wrestling with that question of, where do we fall in this social action? And then the third group I wanted to pick a group that was representative, of the Christian tradition of some sorts. So I'm in Silver Spring, Maryland, and so the Silver Spring United Methodist Church is also kind of a congregation that has gotten itself involved in some social justice movements. So they specifically have launched like a racial justice ministry. They also have a green team, which has been very active in that congregation. They do a lot of nature walks and things where they connect their spirituality with kind of with the earth and with creation, and also do a lot of just kind of land restoration work and things like that. And then they also define themselves as a reconciling congregation. So this would be specifically for LGBTQ ministries. And so those are kind of some of their main movements and some of the ways they're involved. And so I just found kind of an article from Sojourner magazine, which is saying, that social justice is a Christian tradition, not just a liberal agenda. And so looking at, one perspective of social justice as a whole. And so kind of from there, I'll have a conclusion. So I'll definitely admit that my thesis statement, I think, is still in the works. I think I definitely wanted to see kind of where these three groups of traditions, where they take me and what all they're saying. And, just really wanting to offer it as kind of a resource for other groups that are, wrestling with that question of where they fall in certain social justice movements. So,
Okay. Questions? Anyone? Becky, well, let me ask a couple of methodological questions. Did you get most of the information through website, or did you call and do interviews? I'm trying to think about your methodology, how you curated the information.
Yeah, mostly through website. I mean, in a perfect world, I would love to, have been able to go to these locations in person and, attend certain things. But yeah, mostly through websites or, through the kind of their tradition as a whole.
Okay. I think it'll be important for you as a part of your paper, the name, why you selected these three, and what led you to them, so that if someone's reading it, it doesn't like, well, it's the first three I found through Google search. So that you're building, not even as much as you're talking about the where you said introduction to the religious organization. I'm assuming that is these three different centers, or are you thinking about introductions to religious traditions? So that's in your introduction. Are you thinking about, that's where you set up your how you got into engaging each of these organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would, include that. I was thinking, more specifically each like center themselves and wanting to introduce that, but
then that's fine. It's really trying to figure out how you make sure your methodology stands out in the introduction. It doesn't hurt to have a motivation. I mean, partially other than, gee, these are three nice congregations. Why should I pay attention to what you've written? It helps to either name either personal motivation and why that's an aspect of practical theology, or state it in such a way that invites the reader into this. And so, could there be, if you're going to partner with another religious tradition around an issue of social justice, what are some key questions we should ask? And that might be part of what you do in your conclusion, is say, after looking at these three, here are some key themes or key questions. But assume a readership that wants, I mean, as much as for you, it's been an intellectual exercise, try to figure out how to make this inviting for someone to read in such a way it gets their attention. And literally thinking about, why is intersectionality important? Why would social justice be an important theme by which to explore this conversation? It's the why questions underneath that I think really both set up the motivation for me to take the time to read your paper. And then if you go ahead and state, and I'll offer 3 or 4 key themes on the back end that show how this works together. At least as a reader, I'll walk through each segment of your paper, holding off that judgment until you're going to weave things together. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You're in some ways, and this will be one of the videos that I do. Yours is closer to a review of literature than it is arguing a thesis paper, research paper. Normally, a research paper is, here's my argument, I'm going to take you right down the line and prove my point on the back end. What you're doing is saying, here are 3 sort of big wells of information, and I'm going to be your tour guide. So I'm setting out a cartography, a map, if you will, and I'm going to take you through all 3 of these, and then I'll point out the key themes and components on the back end. But for me to even be willing to follow you as a tour guide, I got to know why we're going on the tour. And a good review of literature sets that up early and then takes the time to take you through each of these. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. A couple of things for you to think about. One, and it could be a typo on their website. I think that word is Tierdorf, T-I-R-D-O, Tierdorf, instead of Leerdorf. I think that's from a pretty ancient phrase. So when I first saw it, I thought that looks odd. So I could be wrong, and they've done a variation of another phrase that's been pretty well. I know tzedek is righteous or justice, so I think that's a Hebrew phrase that you might want to go back just to make sure you got that one right. Okay, so that's just a coaching piece. If you're really interested in this, I think there'd be an interesting question of, can different religious traditions actually have good conversation around issues of social justice? And that's not what you've tried to do in this paper. That might be a future paper. But if you've not read or seen the work of Eboo Patel, in his book, Acts of Faith, if you've run into that or seen it referenced in some of the reading, Patel's a very interesting guy. He was up at in Chicago, and he figured out a way of getting young people active in social ministries or social justice issues where they would work in service together. And they came from different religious traditions, and it is through their combined effort in service that they were able to build interfaith conversations. So he calls it the Interfaith Youth Corps, and he's won a number of awards over the years, but it's just a model of taking what you're exploring. What you did, what was interesting was you put different social issues based on each religious tradition. I would not force you to go back and redo that research, but I do think there is an interfaith conversations around the United States. There's always been a strong edge around how issues around service or social justice, depending on how you want to use the language, is probably the best place to have interfaith conversations, instead of around, kind of sharing belief systems and saying who's got the best belief system. It really is when people are serving together, it literally changes the way they relate to each other, regardless of their faith tradition. And that's more than what you're trying to do, but it might be when you're looking for themes on the back end, how you triangulate those themes with some literature. So it's not just your observations out of engaging it, but you have a triangulation there. People like Patel, and you could find articles, you wouldn't have to read his book, that might help you from that standpoint. Okay?
Okay.
All right. Concerns you have with what I've said? Anything?
No, just taking it all in.
Okay. In a way, yours is a I'd say yours and some of the projects we've seen done tonight just work the wheel. I mean, they do. And some of them, I try to get you to reorganize the paper to work the wheel. But a couple of them, Becky, yours is one. Stephen, yours in some ways is somewhat different. Even both of them are kind of organized differently than the wheel per se. And I'm not trying to force you into the wheel. It's more, how do I make sure there is a practical theological conversation? And how do I make my theology explicit? So in that, for you, again, in the conclusion, or for Stephen, it was in the preamble or that opening piece, that might look differently than how the traditional model. And this just reminds us that OSMER is just one model among many. And I like the fact that you're listening to Wolf and the way in which you're trying to think about this conversation. So feel free to use him as a part of the conversation before it's all said and done too. Okay. All righty. Thank you, Becky. Just general questions to this process tonight. Any concerns going forward? Prayer requests? Help me, Jesus moments?
Is it too late to drop the class or?
It's never too late to drop the class, except last night, I think what we did is we allow you to be able to drop it up to the last week. And then at that point, you have to pay me money. So that's kind of the arrangement. And I'm not talking about small change here. We're talking big dollars before it's over with, okay? Now, I will edit this part out of the presentation before I put it up on YouTube. No. Everybody's got great projects. So let me just name it real quick. I mean, everybody here is doing good work. And if you've heard me say sort of three big talking points, one is triangulate your observations or triangulate what you're doing. Make sure you've got a conversation partner, either theological or within the fields of social science. If you're talking about human behavior, then is there someone out there who's written a social science kind of article that confirms your observations of human behavior? If you're thinking about theology, is there a theologian or a theological doctrine or something that helps confirm your things? And so triangulation is really just making sure that your voice always has kind of a backup that kind of supports your observations from that standpoint, either your analysis or your constructive response, or even sometimes your strategic responses. You have to kind of pick how you want to do that. That doesn't mean every other sentence has to have a footnote. You guys have probably had friends who've done papers like that, right? You know, where half the page is regular text and the whole bottom is 18 kind of footnotes. I've seen Bible papers where I can only read 2 sentences and everything else was in the footnote. I'm not asking for that, but I also want you to make sure that you are listening to voices beyond yourself and you're using those strategically as you engage. Okay. I've already talked about just making sure. I don't think I have anybody I'm worried about when it comes to use of human subjects, making sure you have some kind of permission. And I would even, if you can get an email, that's great. If you have an interview, follow up with a phone call to somebody and say, I'm going to use this observation. Do you mind? And I'll send you an email if you can just confirm it's okay to utilize that information. Do that. Do put it in a separate appendix. That way it's not attached to the paper. Does no good to actually hide the names of the people and then list their name in the footnote or have it attached to the appendix. Yes, I have seen that done. So I don't think I've done it, but I have seen that done where people, the worst one is when somebody puts them in initials and they use the same initials as the person's name, and then they have the permissions listed in the appendix, and you can just connect the dot, but I don't think that'll happen here. I'm looking at the clock. Probably the other thing is be sure you're writing to an audience. I mean, I don't want you to have to go back and see all those videos, but I will make sure they're available. Try to write this paper in such a way that it's not what I did on my summer vacation or what I think I'm going to do, but how you're inviting somebody else into this and you're trying to change their mind as you're writing the paper. You're trying to invite them from a perspective of how that they themselves will be changed as a result of reading what you're doing. I think it's okay. I will make sure everybody shares the final version of your papers with each other. I always do that. I don't think knowledge in the class is for your private consumption, nor is it necessarily just a personal exchange between me and you, but that the work you're doing actually is to serve your fellow classmates. This is the task of leadership, by the way, is to take the knowledge that you're receiving and make it available to others. And that should be true in every class at the seminary. That's our goal in some ways. Yes, it's to give you a rounded education. I'm not going to lie, that's really part of it, but it is not merely for your own personal edification. That may surprise you, but the seminary has a mandate that a part of our goal is to shape you into leaders so that the very knowledge you receive, you'll be willing to pass along to others who might not ever have the opportunity to have the same kind of education that you have. That's why we do what we do at the seminary, is to prepare you for the sake of a broader community, the church, yes, for sure, but just for the sake of the community, to take the gifts, graces, the skill, the knowledge that you receive, and then offer it to others. Okay? I would have pitched that next week. I just had an extra 2 minutes to throw it in tonight just to make you nervous. I know when I do the coaching, there'll be some of you right now go, okay, I got to feel, I got to do some pieces. I can get this added in, but I think I can get it all done and turned in. I think I did say next Monday's the deadline, right? I moved it from Friday to Monday. What I'm about to do is the most dangerous thing because it just invites procrastination. We meet next Tuesday night. You know what the reading is. But when it comes to me grading these projects, because I'm still working on the case studies, I probably won't get to them until probably next Wednesday or Thursday. So I'm willing to move Monday night to Wednesday night. That gives you a full week. Now, for some of you, this is not a blessing. I mean, you're going, this doesn't help me at all. You have not met Dr. Johnson, those kinds of things. Yes, I have. I know exactly how bad Andy can be. But I'm going to give you, what I want to give you is at least a week, now that we've had this coaching, to really do the kind of paper you want to do. All of you have heard this before. This is the thing that's really important to me is I like to provide the feedback early rather than surprise you with just the evaluation on the back end. So unless I hear a huge outcry from more than one person, then the deadline has now been moved a full week and a day till Wednesday night. Okay? Is that okay?
Prof. Blevins, what's the actual date for that? Sorry.
Well, today is the 13th. That would be the 21st.
Can I expect the same in the innovation design course as well?
Now, I'm cutting that one back. What are you talking about? So, yeah. Both the good, the bad, the ugly. Is anyone here doing the module class at the end of the semester where you have to come into Kansas City? Have anybody signed up for that? Okay. I do know you have an essay, and I'm going to talk about that next week. So you still have another writing assignment after this paper. But that is but you have the module week to write on. I mean, so I hope you hear from that standpoint. So let's plan on this paper being due, and it gives me at least enough time to try to grade it before you write the essay, so that you have a sense of where your other evaluations, and then we'll talk about what the essay looks like next week. Adam, we'll talk about extension in the other class on Thursday. How many people does that affect? Just two of you, right? Sam and Adam? You're the only two on both? Okay, yeah, maybe I won't cut it back then. Maybe I'll just leave it where, no, I'm just kidding. We'll see. But for this class, I'm looking at the clock. I don't want to keep you late. You now know you've got through till the 21st to get this paper in. Okay, any concerns? If you get it in early, that's fine. Doesn't mean I'll grade it early, no. But if you get it in early, you need to get it off your plate because you got other things you got to do for other classes. that's fine. I just wanted you to have time if you needed that to kind of put in the extra effort. Okay.
Real silly question. For this paper, do you prefer author date or notes citation?
I'm my, how do I say it? It really depends with articles. Let's just say it that way. A lot of times footnotes work a lot better. But let me put it succinctly. I don't care which, as long as both of them follow Turabian, the Chicago Manual Style guidelines. And so if you use in-text citations, then you have a reference or bibliographic page that actually matches what those in-text citations, and take time to look that up. If you're going to do footnotes, do footnote form and style. Do not give me bibliographic citations in the footnote. Take a moment. I mean, you can just look it up online and just type in Turabian or Chicago Manual Style. It's the same, and look for the form and style. So get it done right from that standpoint. Okay.
Your feedback on my paper last semester made me purchase this. So
those of you who know me know I've been an editor now for more than 25 years. That's probably not to your benefit, but it's just, but it is a part of what you do is to write well, is to also know how to cite well. And so I just pick them up. I just notice them a lot of times. I have written and I have evaluated, actually edited in MLA, APA, and Chicago. Actually did one using the Oxford Manual Style in England, which was a pain, but that's another story. So I'm happy for you to use those, but the seminary requires Chicago. So let's learn it while you're at the seminary. And I can recognize that pretty easily from that standpoint. Okay. If you're worried, I will provide the links, and the links may help you. If it's been a while, maybe it's your first research paper in a while, then I would take a moment to watch the videos. And if you have concerns, no, I won't proofread your paper ahead of time, but if you have a specific concern, you can reach out to me by email and we can have a conversation. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. My prayers to everybody. Really, I like what I've heard tonight. I really want to stress this. I mean, I think we've got a lot of good things. And if you've heard each other, we have some very interesting, different kinds of papers that are being done that actually represent the breadth of practical theology. So this is a good thing. I'm really liking what I'm hearing in the way in which we're not all doing the same kind of exegetical work or the same kind of systematic treatise. We've got a lot of interesting projects going on. So that's a good thing at this point in the semester. All right. We'll see you next week. Don't forget to read. Do read the elements. If nothing else, read the end of Black Practical Theology and a couple of chapters in the Practicing Theology. So you have that, and we'll try to make it more of a general conversation and be wrapping up next week. Okay. All right. Blessings to all. Take good care.